Hello and welcome. My name is Nicole Mollenkoff, and I have shared a short summary of my professional background at the end of these slides. The title of my presentation is Applying Lean, a Kaizen Case Study. This is the relevant financial relationship disclosure for this presentation. And these are the learning objectives that will be addressed during this presentation. This slide contains a list of the key abbreviations that will be used in this presentation. Let's begin with a brief self-assessment question. Kaizen, a foundational principle of Lean, refers to the pursuit of continuous improvement, but is also a term for a highly focused Lean project. True or false? When we return to the question, I will provide the answer and discuss the rationale. In this lecture, I will review a Lean tool called the Kaizen event. A Kaizen event is a highly focused, action-oriented quality improvement event. There is a dedicated, empowered team that will take immediate action to improve a process. For Kaizen, project selection is key. People must be very interested in fixing the issue or feel as though they are tackling a huge problem that needs a resolution as soon as possible. Otherwise, there is a pretty big risk of failure. These projects are generally planned over weeks, maybe even a few months, but the actual project itself takes place over usually a week, maybe even 4 or 5 days. They also tend to follow the DMAIC framework, which is define, measure, analyze, improve, and control. I'll talk about that framework in just a moment. So rules for the Kaizen event. First of all, there's no rank. Everyone's important. Now clearly there's a project leader and they help the project stay on track, but everyone on the team is an equal. It's really important that everyone coming to the table for the Kaizen keeps an open mind. In fact, this is really a prerequisite. It's important to have a positive attitude about the project. That's why I said it's so important to choose your project wisely. The other important thing is everyone's got to recognize that change is good. The point of a Kaizen is to identify what is driving the problems and then brainstorm how to fix things, and you can't get there without being open to new ideas and potentially changing the way you do things. Additionally, there's got to be a no blame culture. We can't come into this talking about it's all the nurse's fault or the pharmacy director or the CEO or even each other. We've really got to focus on the system and get at underlying design issues. It is, not about kind of who is doing things wrong, but what is it about the system that's not supporting people to do their best work? And how can we use these quality improvement tools to find solutions? It's really important to be respectful of one another. Again, not just the people in the room working on the Kaizen, but really, respecting the people that are a part of that process kind of across the continuum. We've got to have psychological safety. Everyone in the room needs to feel free to share their ideas. We've got to have, frontline people, managers, different types of leaders like med safety leaders, for example, and everyone needs to, feel like they can share. The other important thing about a Kaizen is planning is key. As I mentioned, it can take weeks to get some data to understand kind of what the process is currently looking like. I've personally been involved in Kaizens where we did planning for 6 to 8 weeks ahead of time. And so, that upfront planning is really crucial in order for you to use that Kaizen period, which, as I said, is usually about 5 days or so. It's really important to plan appropriately so you can maximize your time during that Kaizen. And being prepared for the hard work ahead. During the actual Kaizen, the days can be long. Depending on who's involved, it could be 6 to 8, to maybe 10 hours. You've got frontline folks that are coming in out of their typical work processes into the Kaizen. So they might work, several hours a day as part of that Kaizen. The leaders can work even more. As someone who's led these events, like I said, my teammates may have worked 6 or 8 hours on the Kaizen, but as the leader, I've spent as much as 10 to 12 hours. But here's the thing, that Kaizen, that time frame, and putting in that hard work really will pay off. Some of my most proud med safety work have come through Kaizen events. They can really be transformational, not only to that particular work process, but they can also have a profound impact on the culture in that organization, in that pharmacy, on that nursing unit, wherever that work is taking place. I mentioned I would talk about the DMAIC process. This is a really important framework usually used for Kaizen projects. It was developed in Six Sigma, but it applies to Lean and other performance improvement methods. And this is the framework that's typically used to guide a Kaizen project and to really help the project stay on track. I will just review it briefly. I'm sure in other aspects of the Med Safety Certificate you have learned about this, and certainly possibly in lectures that I've shared. So first of all, the D is for define. So what is the problem? So we'll define the project, commit resources. We'll really, develop a project statement, identify kind of what's going on. In this part of the DMAIC, we'll, develop a charter statement. As I mentioned, we might talk to people who are kind of internal and external customers, we might really outline like what are the inputs and outputs of the process. The M is for measure, and this is where we're measuring baseline performance and determining, kind of what are the, baseline issues. Are we seeing defects? Are there, other problems in the process? So it's really all about understanding the current state. We do things like value stream mapping, look at potential other potential tools like maybe an FMEA, for example. In the analyze phase, we're going to look at what are the key factors driving the current results and really confirm those key factors, looking for relationships between the inputs to the process and the outputs that we're seeing. And those outputs can include different forms of waste and, problems, efficiency problems, satisfaction problems, etc. So really we're looking at all of that data, analyzing that in aggregate, and there are a variety of different, analytic tools that we could use at that step. In the improve phase, this is usually what I think of as the most fun part of the DMAIC. This is where we're optimizing and implementing improvements. So what are the methods we can use to improve the process? How can we get to reduce defects or errors, and how can we get to improved efficiencies and improve staff and customer satisfaction? So we're really, determining what lean improvements we might be able to implement, optimizing those improvements, and then confirming the effects of those improvements. And then finally in the control phase, this is where, we are implementing that process, and then we're going to put in processes to sustain the gains. So, standardized operating procedures, handing off to the process owners, quantifying the gains, demonstrating improved capability, and most importantly, constantly improving the process. So I'm going to use this DMAIC process. I'm going to walk through this for a particular project so that you can see, how this might be done in your work setting. So step one, the define phase. So we'll, as I mentioned, we'll walk through a real project that I did, and I'll first start off by talking a little bit more about kind of what is done in each of those phases, and then I will share the project that I was leading. So first of all, we want to define the project and commit resources. And so committing resources could be, who do you need to work on the project? What staff are important? Obviously, we can't have every single person on staff work on a project, but we need kind of the key players represented. And then you've got to get those resources committed. So if you need, 3 or 4 people and you need them out of the workflow for 4 or 5 days, that is a commitment, a leadership commitment that you'll have to negotiate up front. We want to set clear goals for the project. So, generally we do this in the form of SMART goals, so specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound goals. It's important when you're developing your goals to think about pitfalls as well. So, vague project goal. So not being specific about what you want to do. This is probably problem number one. Scope creep is another big thing that happens frequently. It can get out of hand quickly. Look, this is a Kaizen. This is, something you're going to do over the course of 4 or 5 days. You're not going to solve like world peace. I always like to say you're probably not going to solve the missing dose problem, the original problem that we have in pharmacy, for example. So those big problems, those are really hard things to solve, especially when they really get kind of big and broad. Buy-in, lack thereof, a really high profile problem that requires a quick fix, it's got to have buy-in at every level. And again, that's why I said selecting your project up front is really an important step, and then making sure that all the different factions are on board, whether it's frontline staff, leadership, maybe even leadership beyond your department, but at every level, it's important to have that buy-in. And then these projects, they get off schedule really quickly. So as I mentioned, you take people out of the work setting. So if you need 3 or 4 people, some of them are, typically frontline staff, you can't have them indefinitely. You've got to stay on schedule. So it's really important to use your time wisely and make sure that you're staying on schedule. Another thing in the define phase is that we'll do a voice of the customer analysis, and this could be both internal and external customers. So, what are their needs? What are the people within the process? What are their needs? Ultimately, the people you deliver your product to, what are their needs? What do they want? What are their desires? So there are a lot of different ways to get that information. Usually we do surveys or maybe focus groups. There's not really one kind of way to do this, but it is important to do it and get that information up front. Really, fundamentally, your customers determine your specifications. So your customers should be dictating what the needs of that process are. As I mentioned, you develop a charter. This is really a contract between you and the project champion. You've got to figure out what's your goal, right? So to what degree are you going to solve the problem? For example, maybe it's a 50% reduction in lead time. I worked on a project in the oncology pharmacy where we had some lead time issues and we wanted to reduce that lead time by 50%. Another example would be like, how long does it take, or who will do it, or how much money do you want to save? These are other things that might be incorporated into your goal. This is an example project charter. So this is the project that I'll talk about throughout this presentation. You can see here that this project charter was for our pediatric Cartfill IV production process. You can see the project was sanctioned or championed by the pharmacy director. We had several leaders participating, myself as the medication safety officer, residents, we had pharmacists and others that were involved. We also had a master black belt. So I'm at an organization where we have a lean department, and so we're very lucky to have that resource available to us. These folks were not in the day-to-day on this project, but they were resources. We could reach out to them and get feedback about maybe impasses that we were at, or advice on maybe where to go or what kind of data to collect, that kind of thing. You can see our problem statement. We had variation in the pediatric Cartfill IV production process. This was leading to inefficiency, defects, and staff dissatisfaction. And the impact of this variation was increased risk of patient harm. This is why I was involved, because we had all this variation and it was leading to near misses that were a direct result of the process and the way it was designed. In terms of our goal at the time was to decrease lead time of the IV production process by 20% while improving safety. while utilizing lean principles to incorporate continuous flow, balance, and standard work into the process. The reason we wrote our project goal that way was because we had an allotted amount of time for this work, and we were routinely exceeding that time, which increases the chance of workarounds and unsafe practices. Staff were rushing through their work, safety checks weren't being completed, and a lot of this had to do with variation in the process and just poor design overall. You can see we had frontline pharmacy techs, we had a clinical pharmacist, we had myself as well as a couple different residents, a med safety resident, health systems leadership resident, and obviously lots of different consultants as well. Our scope was very limited just to that IV production process. And, again, we had that define and measure, which was over 6 weeks. And actually, this project didn't start out as a Kaizen. It started out as a regular project. But once we started collecting data, we saw risks that were very concerning, and we had to escalate this into a Kaizen project. So we worked on our analyze over a week, and redesigned the process in the span of a week, and then we implemented over the span of about 4 days. So as I mentioned, you got to get that voice of the customer. These are real questions that we asked of our techs and pharmacists. We surveyed them, and these are our internal customers, right? Of note, we also did ask our nursing colleagues for their perspectives as well. It was a little bit more informal because most of the issues we were hearing were coming from our internal customers, our techs, our pharmacists. But certainly some of the errors that we were seeing that were leaving the pharmacy were being reported to us by nurses. So we did get, both perspectives. But we surveyed our staff. We did a few focus groups. One thing I want to point out is at that time, there was no IV automation in this process. So this was all manual prep and manual checks. So when you look at these questions, some of the things we asked, what did you dislike most about working in this area? What are the biggest problems? What practices did the techs or pharmacists or both engage in that you think are unsafe or could lead to errors and make it less likely that the pharmacist could detect an error? Were there, IV room practices that you engaged in that were good, that were actually helpful, that made it more likely that errors would be detected? And again, as I said, at the time, this was all manual, so it was really important for these processes to be as robust as possible. Subsequent to this project, of course, automation has been implemented, barcode scanning, workflow management, even some automation. But at the time, those technologies, I have to say in retrospect, I thought these were be all end all kind of technologies. But I'll tell you, over the years, as I, went from this project to seeing some of those technologies implemented, I've really been surprised and actually reassured with how important this foundational work was to ensure that those subsequent technologies were introduced safely. You can see some other questions, if you could change anything, what would it be? And is there anything special you do that helps your day run smoothly? So ultimately, we took this info very seriously. This info really informed what we were going to do for this project and actually pushed us to move fast once we understood kind of the true scope of the problems that we were facing. Step 2 is measure. So in step 2, you've got to go watch the process. You've got to understand the current state, and that's what we did. We went and watched. Again, we watched this process for 6 weeks. Not all Kaizens start like that. Ours did start like that. We ultimately collected data. We had 3 direct observers. We collected data over a 6-week time frame. Dozens of shifts over that 6-week time frame. One of the first things that we had to do was, again, watch the process, collect the data, decide what we were going to collect. I mean, of course, we were collecting things like how many different ways were there to do the process, really quantifying variation. how long did it take, how many doses were being prepared, those kind of things. But it was really important up front for us to do a measurement system analysis. And so really this is just assessing the reliability of your data collection methods. So across those three people, we had to do some pilot data collection and really do some QAing across the process to make sure we were all collecting data in the same way so that we weren't introducing bias into the data collection process. We also we did not do a baseline FMEA, which is a failure mode and effects analysis, but I've done other projects where we do that at the start as well, because in your observation you don't always see every single thing that will go wrong, but you can imagine things that could go wrong. And so in that FMEA, that's a really great way to figure out what kind of problems might occur that you may not have seen during your observation. And so, lots of different ways to do data collection, but ultimately you want to think about your process and what makes the most sense. So let me talk a little bit about our workflow at the time and kind of how we evaluated it. So in our initial process, this was a 24-hour cart fill process. When we did this project, a lot of folks were still doing 24-hour cart fills. This was a pediatric pharmacy, so there's a lot of dose prep. And so, we knew that we had some problems in this process. The original process basically, a print job would print off first thing in the morning, like 5 or 6 a.m. and it was generally hundreds of labels. I don't know, somewhere in the neighborhood of like 300 or 400 labels. Our techs would come in. We had 2 techs assigned to this process, and they would take that stack of labels and split it the same way every single day, regardless of how many labels were in that stack. They always split, one tech took A through G, the other tech took H through Z. And then from that moment forward, there was, very little kind of collaboration. They were almost like independent contractors. They worked side by side, but they really didn't work with one another. The first step was to stage the product that they needed. So they would take that stack of labels and they would just kind of manually calculate or guess, which is what we saw a lot of times. They would just kind of ballpark, how much did they think they need? And they would start pulling all of those drugs. You can imagine, some of the problems that came along with that. So this is the floor plan, and I'll walk you through kind of, how they did this initially. So you can see in this picture that there is a table in the center, there's some storage here, there's some storage over here, and then we had the 2 technicians that would kind of work side by side on these tables. They would go over to these storage areas and get all the products. They would get a bin and kind of throw the meds in that bin with all the labels, and then do that staging process right here. So once they had staged the different products that they needed, they would grab those bins and walk over to the fridge. And so you can see they'd walk over to the fridge, place those in the pass-through, and then they would walk out of that space and over into the ante room. They would clean and gown and garb, and then they would enter the room and retrieve the items from the fridge. They would take those over to their cart and place those items on the cart and begin that setup process. And you can see in here that there are basically 2 hoods side by side, again just reinforcing they were just parallel processes. They weren't really working together per se. Then they would begin their setup process. And so in the setup process, they would they would take the individual products, drug by drug, and make all the patient-specific doses. Once they were done with that drug prep, they would put that drug in a bin on the shelf, and this was a kind of a wall of lots of different shelves, and each bin had a different drug, lots of different patient doses within each bin. And then they would wait for the pharmacist to come in and do the pharmacist check. And again, this would be replicated, in that other hood on the other side of the room with the second tech. Okay, so then once the doses were checked, they were just kind of hanging around waiting for a pharmacist to come into the clean room to actually check them. So the pharmacist would come into this area from the oral dose area where they were also working. They would gown and garb, and then they would head into the clean room to actually check those doses that were waiting on the shelves. They would check each drug and all the subsequent patient doses in that area, which was really inconvenient for the pharmacist because they were kind of standing in midair. And then once the doses were checked, they would put them into the cart. And then the pharmacy techs would take those doses, put them back through the pass-through fridge. None of this was really kind of synchronous. It again depended on how busy we were, depended on, how many oral doses were checked, when the pharmacist actually was able to come in and check those IV doses. There wasn't a lot of kind of situational awareness about what was going on. When the techs were finished, they would put all the doses into the pass-through, clean up, exit, and then go and take those checked doses and sort them into the drawers for delivery. One thing I want to point out here is you're probably already thinking, wow, this sounds really unsafe. And trust me, it was. At the time, even at the time, which was, more than 10 years ago, there were obvious practice gaps. Nowadays, a lot of what was going on at this time hopefully is not going on in most of your pharmacies. But one thing I want to point out is, the techs here were unsupervised in the IV room. Even back then, this really it really was standard of care to have someone in the IV room, have a pharmacist in the IV room doing some kind of check before the final prep. Nowadays, we have technology that can help with this, like workflow managers and etc. But at the time, we just didn't have the staff, and the design of this work made it impossible to do something like that. And so, these kind of foundational Kaizens were important because they were ensuring safe prep practices back when we were all manual. But even more importantly, now that we've got some of these different technologies, you've got to really understand your work before you implement those technologies. Otherwise, you're going to automate bad practices. So even ultimately, when we went on to implement different technologies, fixing this process up front made it so much easier to implement some of the subsequent technologies like barcode scanning and workflow managers, etc. So let me show you a few pictures of what this looked like. First of all, we identified many safety issues. Again, this was a little while ago, but I still get upset when I look at these pictures. You're all safety folks, so I imagine you feel the same way looking at some of these pictures. There are lots of issues going on here. Issues with staging, setup, preparation process. Fundamentally, there just wasn't visual management in this process. There was no separation of products for each batch. Everything was being thrown into one big bin. Despite all of our elaborate storage requirements, we had all kinds of LASA drug requirements for the drugs when they were unpackaged, at intake. But then all of that kind of got tossed aside and everything ended up in a single bin. Certainly we had some techs that were a little more maybe attention to detail and they would individually bag things, but that certainly wasn't the practice across the board. And you can see in this picture, how dangerous things really could be. Once the techs got into the clean room, they had that bin with kind of everything thrown in it. Then they had to do a lot of rework, right? They had to figure out how to resort everything. They would lay out all the labels and resort the drugs. It was really inefficient, obviously very easy to make mistakes. Some of this was driven by like that upfront process where there really wasn't a good way to know how much was needed. There wasn't really a good method to kind of stage things. Sometimes the techs would have too much or they wouldn't have enough. Sometimes like excess product would kind of lie around in the clean room, which is a violation. There wasn't a standard for what needed to be prepared. Again, this was a pediatric pharmacy, so we would have to prepare stock solutions. And so, some techs made just enough for the shift, or they would eyeball what they needed. There really wasn't a standard. And again, just so many opportunities for error and inefficiency. Additionally, there was a lot of batching. I mean, this is a real picture from our observation. Again, horrifying, right? I mean, when I took this picture, this is probably the moment when I realized I have to escalate this right away. I don't think people really appreciated kind of the unsafe practices that we had going on at the time. You can see more than one drug in the hood at a time, more than one patient being worked on at a time, unlabeled syringes, different look-alike, sound-alike products. There was a rule at the time, or a policy, if you will, that only one drug could be worked on at a time. But because of the poor design of this process, there was nothing guiding a single piece flow process. And furthermore, because of time production issues, we were, kind of cutting corners, and we were asking for trouble. And as you all can imagine, this was extremely concerning. So again, lots of different kind of issues going on here. In addition, the space just didn't work. So there really wasn't a lot of room to check. You can see the pharmacist is kind of like right on top of the technician. Um, the pharmacist kind of had to hold this stuff in midair to check it. There was no countertop or, any place that the pharmacist could lie things down if needed. It was kind of cramped. There was heavy traffic through this area. You can see that walkway like right adjacent to the work area. There was this bin. This is where the check doses would go. And the problem with that is the bin under it was a bin that contained lots of different stock solutions that the technician needed to prepare doses. So, not everything was a safety issue, but clearly efficiency issues were in play, and just all around difficulties that made it more likely that people would cut corners in order to get the job done. And so we really weren't designing for safety when you look at this workflow. In step 3, we'll analyze that data. So all that data that was collected in the measurement phase, we're going to look at that data and figure out what are the key inputs that are driving the issues with our outputs. What are the key issues from a quality or safety or even efficiency perspective. Now, there are a variety of ways this can be done. We can look at the data from a practical perspective, a graphical perspective, and or an analytical perspective. Practically, we just look at the data. We ask questions, maybe even brainstorm about what the data is telling us. This is really common in Lean, to kind of take a practical approach to the data. We also look at it graphically, so we may visually represent the data, in different types of diagrams, like a scatter diagram or a Pareto diagram, for example, which can, help us see what are the, major issues potentially, causing the majority of the problems, for example, with the Pareto diagram. We can also look at it analytically, so look at behavior, relationships, tendencies. We tend to use statistical tools here, lots of different statistical tools. Analysis of variance, or ANOVA, is one that I've used several times, can be really helpful, but really any of your statistical tools, depending on what the data is and the type of data. But these, again, can be very helpful in analyzing the Lean data. So, what did our initial data tell us? Well, first and foremost, it told us that our division of labor was not balanced, right? So thinking through Lean tools, some important tools or principles are balance and standardized work, and do we have pull systems or more of a pull system in place? We could look at our data and know right off the bat we had a balance problem. It was pretty bad how our tech work was split, right? Because they were kind of, like I said, independent contractors. They always split at the same point, regardless of how much work was present. We saw from our first 6 weeks of observation that, more than half the time, one tech finished at least 30 minutes sooner than the other pharmacy tech. There was no teamwork happening. The other tech would leave, and the tech that was left behind was struggling to finish their work, typically working through breaks and that kind of thing. We also looked at cycle time. Cycle time is how much time does it take to do that portion of the overall task. For us, our overall task was the IV batch, but this part of that IV batch, this cycle, was the IV dose prep, right? So how much time did we have to do that IV dose prep and check? And if you look at, the data here, it was ranging anywhere from 151 minutes to 313. Well, again, out of the gate, that's a problem because this part only had 255 minutes allotted to it. And so again, more than half the time, people were working outside of that allotted time. Finally, what also stood out to us was just variation. There was no standardized work. There were so many different ways to approach the work. Some were safe, some were even quite efficient, but many times they were dangerous. They sometimes were inefficient. Sometimes they made things harder for other people in the process, like the pharmacist, for example. Think back to some of those pictures I showed you. And so you can see we saw seven different ways to stage, 12 plus different ways to do the setup in the IV room, which I would argue is that whole step, is that even necessary? Like, that's complete rework when you look at this from a lean perspective. And then of course, drug prep, 5 or more different ways. Again, some of those were extremely unsafe, which, think back to some of those pictures I showed you. We also looked at waste. So we saw that there were lots of defects, so medication errors, and many of these were secondary to a lack of standardized work. Overproduction, so again, this was a pediatric pharmacy, so we had stock solutions that had to be prepared. And there was really no rhyme or reason to how much was prepared, when they were prepared, who prepared them. It was left up to each individual tech without much oversight at all. And this resulted in a lot of waste. We were throwing away a lot of drug product every single week. And so that was another thing that we tracked. Waiting. So pharmacy techs, pharmacist time, waiting on one another, lack of, kind of a common mental model about what needed to be done, and really not a lot of situational awareness about where each other were in the process. Inventory, not only excess drug, as I mentioned, or wasted drug, but really excess supplies that were coming into the IV room, excess drug that was coming into the IV room. And really just kind of lying in wait, waiting to cause problems. A lot of motion. I just have the pharmacist checking in the IV room listed here, but you saw on kind of that diagram how there was just a lot of motion moving around. And my favorite one, employee creativity. So this is waste in that we weren't utilizing employee creativity. We had some people that had really great processes, but we weren't looking at who was doing a great job and taking that knowledge and incorporating that into our standard work for everyone doing the process. And that's just purely a loss of human capital there. So a lot of waste built into this process. So in step 4, you improve the process. So this is where you brainstorm and you try to figure out how do you improve. Obvious areas where we brainstorm. We try to look at waste. We look at data from our analysis step. How can we remove waste? How can we balance the process? Is there an opportunity for visual processes that can be implemented? Kanban is a visual process where you can really see the next step in the process, and that drives the process. Level loading or Hijunka is where we balance the process. I already mentioned there was a complete lack of balance in this process. Usually we do rapid cycle PDSAs to figure out the best method forward. In our project, we did do that, so I'll describe how we did that. So all of our team members brainstormed. Once we had all of this data, we presented this data, we shared all the data, the pictures, all the different variation that we saw, the time overages. This was on day 1 of our Kaizen. So we had collected that data for 6 weeks, and then on day 1, we got that group together and we shared all that information. The other thing we did on day 1 is we trained or even retrained. Some of these folks had been trained on Lean before, but we trained them all together on what is Lean all about. What is single piece flow? What is level loading? What is standardized work? Why are these concepts important? And in fact, after that training, our pharmacy director came in and talked to the Kaizen group and said, "Look, I'm empowering you to fix this process. I want you to use these lean principles to develop a new process that is balanced, that is efficient, that incorporates safety into the process, that is something that everyone is going to be satisfied with." And he told them on, that Monday afternoon, "I'm going to hear what you guys have come up with on Friday. And I hope that, you really take these lean learnings to heart when you're redeveloping that process." And so that's exactly what they did. It was really amazing. One of the first things they suggested was creating the A team, where we have one tech that stages and one tech that prepares. I think one of the most important things that I saw in this data was not a single dose was prepared in the first hour in our original process. It would take over an hour for the very first dose to be prepared because there was so much going on in getting everything together, moving things around. And by creating that A team, we reduced that down to like 15 minutes. It was really impressive. Other things, they saw that batching was unsafe and they really didn't want people working on more than one drug at a time, and to every extent possible, one patient at a time. Now, this is by fundamentally a batch, right? It's a 24-hour batch. So, clearly for a particular drug, we're going to be working on multiple patients, but they didn't want people working on more than one drug at a time. And they also felt that it was really important to have visual management. They recognized the complete lack of situational awareness built into this process. So they suggested things like different color bins based on what was being prepared. So, one color for the stock solutions, which we called dilutions, versus another color bin for when we're preparing patient-specific doses. They wanted to reduce waste, and they had lots of ideas of how to do that. They wanted to check the dilutions, before they were used to prepare doses. This is another point where I say I was, really stunned at how we were doing this at the time. And they were actually preparing dilutions, using them to make doses, and then that dilution would be checked after the fact. And I don't need to tell any of you that that is just a flat out unacceptable practice. So that was the first thing that we wanted to get rid of. They also created this IV volume report. So we knew that we needed just-in-time production, in order to check those products before they were used for preparation, but we needed data for this. And so we created this IV volume report. And basically what would happen is we would spit out a one-page report that printed with the label job that showed exactly what drugs were in that batch, how many doses were needed for each drug, and the exact volume you needed to prepare all of those doses. It's shocking that that didn't exist, but at the time, the techs were just kind of manually figuring that out. Other things they suggested, use ready-to-use products. For example, vancomycin was a product we could use that was ready to use. They also wanted a better process for the pharmacist checks because, again, that was kind of a very inconvenient way to check. And they wanted to implement standardized work. So at every position, they wanted to develop the best possible work at that moment, standardize that, and spread that out to all of the people who did the process. So this is what our kind of first flow diagram looked like. So we developed a new process based on that A-team concept. We had both techs working as a team. This is the actual diagram that we use with Post-it notes. This is a great way to develop a new process flow, by the way. We could, move all those Post-its around and kind of keep moving them around until we came up with something that we wanted to try. So our first attempt at trying this process was on a Wednesday. So we started the project on Monday, we brainstormed on Monday afternoon and Tuesday, and then we went to work on Wednesday and we actually took this process over and tried our new A-team idea. Wednesday night, let me rephrase. Wednesday day, we collected all kinds of data and we looked at that data after the shift. We made some adjustments and then we tried it out on Thursday. And then, we kind of did our final data collection on Friday and implementation on Friday. And again, we collected all the same data, number of doses, how long it took to produce the batch, how long it took to check. the variation in the process. We actually interviewed the people that did that process to get some feedback from them. And again, with each of those iterations, we made some adjustments and then, we tried it out. So let me show you what that updated process looks like. First of all, you may recognize that originally my table was over here and my IV room was over here. As I mentioned, this was a pretty big space. There was an IV room kind of up here at the top. There was a, big drug storage area in the middle, and then another clean room on the other side. The first thing we did was, why do we have people walking all the way over here when there was an IV room adjacent to the space that we had to prep? And so we asked if we could use this space, and we kind of flip-flopped. There were other folks in this space, and so we flip-flopped our productions, and we were able to use this space, which was definitely going to decrease motion and movement and that kind of thing. First thing you might notice is we had one tech stationed outside doing the staging and another tech stationed immediately inside doing the preparation. So as soon as the shift started, this tech would start staging, this tech would come in and start getting the IV room ready. So the staging tech and then the preparation check. And then basically what would happen is the staging tech would put one item at a time through the fridge. The preparation tech would take that item over to the preparation area, prepare it, and then put it back in the fridge, and that would come out to this checking station. And so the pharmacist no longer had to go into this area to actually check the doses, which turned out to be, from a satisfaction standpoint, very important, but also from a safety standpoint, made it easier for the pharmacist to actually check the product. So a few pictures. I'll point out some of the elements of the new process. First of all, we automated smartly. We used data from our health information technology to spit out that report, and that printed at the start of the shift with all the dilution volumes for the day. We were wasting time, money, and effort in that old process, and now we knew exactly what volume we need. We could make that each day at the start of the shift, and it was a really easy process. So as I mentioned, we created that report, and that would print along with the label job, and then that tech would use that to stage each product. The very first thing they would do is they would stage the dilutions that were needed. So again, we had pediatric stock solutions that were being used that were to prep doses before they were even checked, which again, I'm embarrassed to say that was actually happening. But honestly, by the way, I don't think anyone realized it. Leadership. I mean, the frontline pharmacists did, but they were doing their best to get through that process on a daily basis. But we knew when we found that out, it had to stop immediately. So in this new system, we prepped all the dilutions first, then they were checked. They came back out to be checked, and then once they were checked, the tech that was the staging tech could use those dilutions to stage patient-specific doses. And so you can see here we had some visual controls in place. The green bins were stock solutions, and so we had in and out bins. You can't see it on this picture. I apologize. At the very bottom, that's out. So these green bins are dilutions that have been prepped and they're ready to be checked. And these bins up here are the in bins, and these are bins that are going into the IV room to be prepped. So again, as a pharmacist, they could walk in at any time and see exactly where we were in the production process, which was never possible before. I could walk in as the pharmacist and I could see, I still have some green bins that are stock solutions that are being prepped, so I knew kind of where we were, or I could walk into that area and see that there were bins ready for check, and again, see exactly where we were in the process. The other really important part was one-piece flow. So you can see here the tech inside the IV room has one bin, there is one drug, and then of course the labels for the patient specific doses that they were preparing. And before, this looked a lot different, very unsafe. Obviously, even this, there's still lots of room for improvement, right? It wasn't completely ideal. There was no automation at this point, but certainly this set the standard. It was a precursor for implementing those subsequent technologies. The tech would take the bin from the pass through, prepare it, and then put it back in the pass through on the out section. Finally, step 5 is the control phase. So in the control phase, as I mentioned, this is where you really want to sustain the gain, right? You create new operating procedures, you put a control plan in place, you monitor, and really as the Kaizen leader, you transition this process back to the process owners if you're not that person. You may be, one and the same. So in our control phase, we at this point, we had done a couple PDSA cycles. We were really satisfied with the process that we developed, but we couldn't just turn around and implement it the next day. We had to transition this work back to the frontline staff because we only had 3 or 4 of us that were part of that Kaizen. We couldn't just turn this over to the frontline staff the next day. So we went back to our old process for about a week, and in that time, we developed standard work documents and we trained everyone. And this is the best thing about Lean. I didn't have to do that. This is really like the brilliance of Lean. We had frontline people. We had 4 techs, we had a pharmacist, we had some residents. They took that newly designed process. They created the standard work documents. You can see one example here. This was the staging of dilutions, and they created these trainings. Ultimately, we had like maybe 5 pieces of paper, and they were posted, where they occurred, and this is what we used to train everybody. And the technicians created these, which is, again, the most brilliant part about Lean. So we created that training plan, we trained everybody over a week, and then we implemented that new process. But we also created a control plan that included elements such as daily check-ins, monitoring of the data, looking at that every day, every week, every month, ongoing. We really needed to quantify those benefits, the improved safety of the process, the improved efficiency, capability, satisfaction, etc. One of the things we looked at was cycle time, as I already mentioned. Cycle time was how long did it take to prep and check that particular, or I'm sorry, for this it was just prep. How long did it take to prep that batch? And so you can see we have doses on the x-axis and then rate on the y-axis, which is seconds per dose. And so when you look at this, you'd think that the number of doses would be a major driver for that rate, right? But it actually was not as closely related as we thought it should be. We used a statistical test called the coefficient of determination, and it was really low. So our coefficient of determination was 0.33, and this is the coefficient of determination is really how much of your output is driven by your key input. We want this coefficient to be as close to 1 as possible, but you can see it wasn't anywhere near 1. For example, if you look at 275 doses, look at that range, look at that variation. It could be anywhere from 43 seconds per dose all the way up to 65 seconds per dose. And maybe some of you are thinking, oh, well, maybe it has to do with the different dilutions or the different drugs. Maybe there was more technique with some drug versus the other. But across these days, the drugs themselves were very, very similar. And so this variation really speaks to the fact that there was an underlying problem in this production process. When we implemented our new process and we collected data over 10 days, we saw a much tighter process. That coefficient of determination was much higher. It was 0.8 on average over that time frame. And this makes a lot more sense. And for us, this was a win because it created a process that people liked, but also a process that made sense, that was more efficient, and even from a statistical perspective, it made sense. So looking at the process, continuous improvement is what Kaizen is all about, right? So we didn't stop there. We're constantly improving this process, every day, every week, the first month, the first year, and so on. So we're constantly looking at those cycle times. We're looking at feedback from people in the process. We collect all sorts of data. And, we had regular check-ins every single day, especially in the first month. We had daily check-ins. One of the things we learned very early on, I would say, within like the first couple, like maybe the first week or two, was that there was a problem with the volume report. The techs complained that when they looked at that list, they couldn't clearly see like which of those products were a stock solution that needed to be prepared. And it really didn't stand out. And so what we did, if you look at this picture, we put black boxes. So it was just a quick click where this report could be formatted to have boxes around the stock solutions that were needed. And so, as soon as the technicians saw this list, they could just get those stock solutions staged right away. So again, that continuous improvement and constant adjustments that we were making based on staff feedback. Within 2 years, other things we wanted to do, we wanted to go from a daily batch to more of a just-in-time production, several batches per day. We did a subsequent project to this where we used modeling and simulation to figure out what was the best frequency and time of day to do that batch process. Ultimately, we ended up with 3 batches per day scheduled kind of at these optimal times throughout the day in order to reduce costs, reduce drug waste, but also to make things as safe as possible. For example, if we knew doses were routinely changed at the 8-9 o'clock hour, we would wait until after those changes to schedule the batch. And that's a safety improvement because in the old process, those doses would be prepared and sent to the unit potentially creating risk of the wrong dose being administered. Within 5 years, we wanted, more technology built into this process. Now, at this point, 5-year point, I was no longer working in this pharmacy. I'm still at the organization, but I've moved on, to other divisions in patient safety. But they continued this work. They enabled, they implemented barcode enabled checking and preparation. Some of this came with some tech upgrades that were available within the EHR. Again, I wanted, ingredient and volume checks at the preparation point probably 10 years before it got implemented. But again, this continuous improvement work, that's what it's all about, getting to that point. I mean, even to the point where, now they've got barcode scanning, workflow managers with photo capture built in. And, obviously the ultimate goal is automating as much of that compounding as possible, to every extent possible. And again, this comes back to our lean principle of automating smartly where feasible. All right, so just in conclusion, looking back at the House of Toyota, you can see we utilized almost every concept in this particular Kaizen, right? Putting people at the heart of things. So we had frontline staff engaged. We made them responsible for redesigning the process and really driving those continuous improvements. Some of the things that they did, they balanced the work, right? So that concept of Hijunka, balanced the workflow with that A team. They built in standardized work at each step and supported that with operational method sheets. They created a culture of continuous improvement, which is what Kaizen is all about. And for this process was really crucial, and that exists to this day with all those subsequent improvements that I outlined. They created a just-in-time mentality, in particular around the creating stock solutions at the start of the shift. This definitely improved safety, but it also improved efficiency. It reduced waste. They built in quality with that concept of separating man and machine's work, right? So, for example, we had that process where people were trying to figure out how much they needed and just kind of using manual math to do that. But we programmed that report and we completely eliminated that. And that in and of itself improves quality, but it also helps really free people up to use their brains for tasks that they need them for. So really kind of across the board, we used a lot of those lean principles. Just a couple things to keep in mind if you take on a Kaizen project. There are lots of pitfalls that you need to look out for. First of all, be cognizant of who you need for the project. Get the formal and the informal thought leaders to the table. You've got to get the right people there or your Kaizen's going to fail. The long-term viability of the project improves if you've especially got informal leaders on board, but certainly the formal leaders as well. I can tell you right now, this project would have been a complete flop if just the bosses did it. Really having a diverse role representation was important, including all the people and all the different voices really made the difference. Training, so lack of training is really problematic. People need to understand the method, so you may need to do some kind of just-in-time training, which is what we did at the start of our project. And you've got to communicate. Inadequate communication or poor communication will completely tank the project at every level, but especially in the implement and sustain steps. What we did was, we didn't want to go back to our old process for a week, but we knew we had to. We had to get our training right. We had to get everybody on board. And so we really paid attention to our communication and training so that once we implemented, it would stick. Other things that are pitfalls, not creating a sense of urgency, really being cognizant of like, why now? Really highlighting like, what is the crisis? What are the potential opportunities? What are the potential risks? These are really important steps. Scope creep, I already talked about this, but try not to choose something that's too big that you can't finish. Make sure you've got a good team and that people are comfortable working together. And you've got to have the right support. Don't undertake a lean that's under leveraged, right? If you need people for a week, then you've got to figure out how you can get those people there. If not, the project probably won't be successful. And I think the last two are probably the most important. Failing to develop and follow through with a sustain plan. How are you going to implement and sustain these gains? Another thing I think people fail at is just doing one event and stopping. The beauty of lean is that it's continuous improvement. So whether it's just continually improving that process or moving on to other targets and continually improving the work. So keys to success, kind of in contrast to all the things we just mentioned, be flexible, vary your approach. Lean is a wonderful tool, but you may use some elements of Six Sigma. You may use PDSA, like you saw in our project, we did that. You've got to go to the Gemba and look at like, how's the work getting done, right? Get out of your armchair, they say. Keep in mind, there is no best way to implement lean. Even within the approach, there's not necessarily one best way. There's certainly guidance to keep close to your heart, like, people have to be at the center of things. But there's no linear path or roadmap to follow. There's not one way to do this. Each work area is different, and you may, have to look at things like a little uniquely, but use the tools. They will serve you well. Tackle important projects, especially for Kaizens. And then I think the most important thing is focusing on learning and progress to drive change, not perfection. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Lean is all about being directionally correct. Move in the right direction. Get started. Move your dot. Learn by doing. Do those PDSA cycles. You don't have to have it perfect out of the gate. You just have to get started and do the work and keep continually improving. And finally, create integration. Look, there's so much opportunity to engage and develop employees and staff, teach them, trust them to do the work. Leadership and management should get involved, but really the frontline people can do this. And so really trust them. All right, so let's go back to that self-assessment question. Kaizen, a foundational principle of lean, refers to the pursuit of continuous improvement, but is also a term for a highly focused lean project. Yes, so this is true. Kaizen is a foundational principle of lean, right? It's the idea that we're constantly pursuing continuous improvement. But Kaizen is also a particular event that's a highly focused project, and we utilize the DMAIC process to help us continuously improve in that short time frame. Okay, so some conclusions. Leading and managing change is critical to continually improving medication use systems. Lean can be a really effective tool to help in that process. There are other frameworks though, and these have proven success. and will help you lead and manage change. They provide structure and direction to that change process. So in this lecture, I talked about the DMAIC. I talked about using the DMAIC in that lean framework as a Kaizen event. And again, these tools can be really useful to provide some structure and direction to that process. Sustainability, though, relies on the development of a culture of continuous improvement, and you can support that through using these tools like Kaizen, but you've really got to understand the effective use of these tools and methods and build a system around those improvements to guide that performance. So like you heard with that Kaizen, we didn't just stop there. We really kept that work going, and we used the model to help us keep that work going. And ultimately, projects like a Kaizen are going to be most successful when you really embrace that deeply ingrained philosophy of trust and engagement and bring the frontline staff into those processes so that they can understand what their work looks like and really contribute meaningfully to improving that work. These are the references that were used to develop the presentation. And finally, thank you for your time and participation.